Mistmoor town awakens under a slate-gray sky, the early morning fog draped over houses and the town square like a thick, quiet veil. Residents move slowly through their morning routines, bundled against the October chill as a light drizzle begins to fall. As the first few cars roll through town, Mistmoor's streets echo with the same quiet hum that defines this secluded village, unchanged, timeless. News spreads early of the passing of Adeline Armstrong, an elderly woman who was well-liked by the town's residents. Known for her gentle nature and always feeding the birds in the square, Adeline had lived in Mistmoor for most of her life. Her passing brings a gentle wave of sadness, though it's softened by her age and known health troubles. Most people agree that she went peacefully in her sleep, and the village's mourning continues on. It's just after 8 a.m. when a second death is reported. Victor Davidson, a strong, relatively young man, is found dead on his living room floor. His wife, Evelyn, had discovered him early that morning, believing at first that he'd merely fallen asleep in his chair. The paramedics' arrival brings whispers among neighbors who can't understand how someone so healthy could die without warning. Whispers spread through Mistmoor with the first jolts of unease. As Evelyn's neighbors gather, hushed voices float through the crowd, some suggesting that the fog seems unusually thick and heavy today, others remembering Adeline's death earlier in the morning. But they try to brush it off. Coincidences happen. By mid-morning, the fog lifts slightly, and the gray drizzle continues. Felix Underwood, a respected carpenter, is the third to pass away. He's found in his workshop, his hands still clasped around a chisel as though he'd been carving moments before he fell. A customer finds him, assuming he'd fallen asleep until she notices the stillness of his chest. His face, like the others, appears peaceful. The unexpected deaths start to gnaw at the townspeople, whispers of something going around creeping into conversation. Residents begin locking doors, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. A local mother, Tessa Porter, pulls her young children inside, muttering to her husband about how something feels wrong today. Meanwhile, the town's doctor, Miles Foster, is called in to examine the bodies but finds nothing conclusive. No signs of illness, no apparent injury, only expressions that are too serene. The only anomaly he notices is a faint, dark smudge on the palms of each victim. Curious but unsure what to make of it, he decides not to alarm the residents, hoping it's an isolated incident. By now, the mood in Mistmoor is shifting. Neighbors look at each other warily, some crossing themselves or clutching old talismans. Small groups form in the square, exchanging theories. Perhaps it's a strange illness, some say. Others bring up old superstitions, wondering aloud if there's more to these deaths. Some residents suggest bringing in help from outside, but Mistmoor's isolation makes quick solutions impossible. The town's librarian, Evelyn Kane, watches quietly from the doorway of her house, her brow furrowed. In her line of work, she's read countless accounts of strange happenings in other towns, ancient folklore with roots as dark as they are bizarre. She wonders if Mistmoor, a town long untroubled by modern chaos, could somehow be touched by something equally inexplicable. As the noon bell tolls, Mistmoor feels like a town haunted, waiting in quiet dread. Small tremors of panic begin to spread, each resident watching their neighbor with eyes shadowed by worry, clutching children close and peering warily out of their windows. All try to go about their day, but there's an underlying tension, an awareness that the 3 deaths may only be the beginning. By 10 a.m., word of the deaths has gripped Mistmoor in a quiet but growing panic. The fog has lifted, but a deeper unease has settled over the town. Every hour seems to bring fresh news of another sudden passing. Phoebe Hawkins, a lively schoolteacher, is found slumped over her breakfast table, eyes closed as if in a peaceful slumber. Her family is stunned. She was young, full of life. This was not supposed to happen. With 4 more deaths by mid-morning, small crowds gather around the town square, faces drawn and worried. People exchange anxious glances, whispers rippling through the group. Some say it's a disease, moving swiftly and silently through the air. Others talk of curses, recalling old superstitions about Mistmoor's buried secrets. But no one has answers, only fear. Dr. Miles Foster, Mistmoor's only physician, has been examining the bodies all morning. He struggles to find anything unusual beyond one chilling detail: a faint, dark smudge on each victim's left palm. He brushes it off at first, but with each new death, the mark's presence feels more ominous, a strange signature left behind by whatever has taken these lives. He makes a mental note to investigate, though he keeps this discovery from the town, hoping it's just an odd coincidence. As noon approaches, tension mounts. Mistmoor, a town usually bound by trust and familiarity, begins to unravel as paranoia creeps into the minds of its residents. Some begin locking their doors and keeping their families inside, convinced there's something malevolent lurking just outside. The town council holds an emergency meeting, led by Owen Ellis, Mistmoor's steadfast mayor, who struggles to mask his own fear. He insists that the residents stay calm, that the town will investigate the matter thoroughly. But his assurances ring hollow, and more people are now openly questioning what's really happening. Some suggest reaching out to larger authorities, though Mistmoor's isolation makes quick assistance unlikely. Meanwhile, local historian Evelyn Kane senses something familiar about the unsettling events. In her work, she has come across eerie patterns of death in the town's history, whispered tales of days when Mistmoor seemed touched by some dark force. She hesitates to speak up, but as the death toll rises, the memories grow harder to ignore. As noon arrives, the air in Mistmoor grows heavier, weighed down by a dread that's palpable. People watch each other with new suspicion, clutching their children close, whispering about strange signs, and wondering if the town itself has turned against them. And yet, the question lingers on everyone's lips, unspoken but understood. How many more will die before the day is done? The noon sun does little to lift the shadows over Mistmoor. By 12 p.m., the town's death toll has climbed to a staggering 10 people. Men, women, and even children taken without warning. The fog has cleared, but the chill in the air feels sharper, almost biting, as if Mistmoor itself has turned cold. Every hour seems to bring fresh grief, and with it, fresh fear. Graham Vargas, a middle-aged teacher respected and well-loved, becomes the latest to fall, his body found at the foot of his front porch. His neighbors find him, frozen in an eerie calm, hands resting peacefully on his chest. Residents begin pulling shutters closed, avoiding eye contact, and rushing from house to house. The once friendly town is tense and withdrawn, a place where familiar faces now wear expressions of deep suspicion. The townspeople can no longer brush off what's happening as coincidence. Some speculate about a virus, others about a curse, and whispers of an evil day begin to surface. The town's old stories, once laughed off as myths, are spoken of in solemn, fearful tones. The town doctor, Miles Foster, gathers with Owen Ellis and Evelyn Kane in the town hall, their voices low and somber. Miles shares his observation about the dark smudge on each victim's left palm, a strange mark he's never seen before. Though he tries to keep calm, the three of them know this is unlike anything they've faced. They discuss sending samples to the nearest lab, but Mistmoor's isolation means it would be days before answers could come. Meanwhile, a group of townsfolk approaches the town's only church, desperate for comfort and protection. Henry Thompson, the priest, holds an impromptu prayer session, calling for strength and safety. But the fearful faces around him only deepen his own dread, and he glances nervously at the dark smudge on his own hand, a mark he had tried to ignore. By 1 p.m., fear is at a fever pitch. Every new death feels like an omen, every conversation a hushed exchange of mounting terror. Families huddle together indoors, each moment filled with a sense of impending doom. Mistmoor feels like a town under siege, its people helpless and haunted, yet unsure of what or who the true enemy is. As the church bell tolls for each passing hour, the sound resonates through the town like a death knell, each ring marking the lives already lost and the silence that looms ahead. The townspeople can feel it in their bones now. Something is wrong with Mistmoor, and it's only growing worse. By 2 p.m., Mistmoor's usual quiet is shattered by a sense of growing dread that grips every street, every home. It's as if the town itself is holding its breath, waiting for something unseen to break the silence. Just hours earlier, Mistmoor's residents had gone about their morning routines in peace. Now they're a community on edge, haunted by an unspoken question. How many more will die today? More townsfolk gather around the square, exchanging theories, watching each other with wary eyes. Children are pulled indoors, while friends and neighbors keep their distance, uncertain who to trust. Fear has settled into every conversation, every glance, and Mistmoor feels less like a town and more like a ticking clock, counting down to some dark end. In his small clinic, Dr. Miles Foster stands over the still body of Landon Reese, the latest victim, a local mechanic in his early 30s. Landon had been well known for his humor and an optimism that seemed almost out of place in Mistmoor. Now his face is blank, calm, with the same haunting stillness as the others. Miles stares at the faint smudge on Landon's palm, the same dark stain he's seen on every single victim today. It almost resembles soot, though it doesn't rub off and leaves no residue on his gloves. Miles leans back, trying to make sense of it. He's exhausted, his mind racing with worry, and each time he closes his eyes, he imagines that smudge spreading, reaching out from each victim's hand to claim more lives. Miles has been Mistmoor's doctor for nearly 20 years, and he's faced illness, injury, even the occasional outbreak of flu. But this feels like something beyond medicine, beyond any diagnosis he can make. He's jolted from his thoughts by the sound of the clinic door opening. Owen Ellis, Mistmoor's mayor, steps inside, his face drawn with worry. "Miles," he says, his voice barely more than a whisper, "we've lost 3 more in the past hour." Miles feels a cold shiver run down his spine. 3 more? The deaths are accelerating, and at this rate, he can barely finish the thought. "Is there anything at all you're finding?" Owen asks, desperation edging his voice. Miles hesitates, glancing down at the bodies on the examination tables around him. "Just the mark," he says, pointing to Landon's hand. Owen steps closer, peering at the smudge with a frown. "It's strange," Miles continues, "and it's on every one of them. I don't know what it means. I can't find a cause of death. It's as if their lives just ended." Owen rubs a hand over his face, his mind racing. "We need answers, Miles. People are scared. The town is tearing itself apart out there." He lets out a shaky breath, glancing toward the door. "We're running out of time." Outside, the atmosphere in Mistmoor has shifted. People linger in small groups, exchanging glances filled with suspicion. Neighbors who have known each other for years now speak in hushed voices, their faces shadowed with fear. Conversations are short and tense, with more than one person casting an uneasy glance over their shoulder. At the town's only general store, Phoebe Hawkins, the store's owner and one of the town's most trusted figures, has kept her doors open, though no one ventures in. Instead, she stands behind her counter, watching through the window as people hurry by. She catches glimpses of familiar faces, but the look in their eyes is unfamiliar, tinged with fear and mistrust. Phoebe knows these people, has served them for years, yet today, she feels as though Mistmoor is filled with strangers. Across town, Henry Thompson, the local priest, has opened the doors to Mistmoor's small church. People gather inside, huddling in the pews, their heads bowed in silent prayer. Henry watches them, feeling the weight of their fear, but he's struggling with his own. He, too, has seen the mark on the victim's hands, and he can't shake the feeling that it's connected to something darker, something beyond this world. In a low voice, Henry addresses the crowd. "Stay strong," he says, though his voice trembles. "We must stand together. Whatever is happening, we will face it as one." But his words feel hollow, and he can see the doubt in their faces. They're not here because they believe, they're here because they're desperate. Around 2:30 p.m., whispers begin to spread through Mistmoor, wild theories about what's happening. Some residents claim the town is cursed, that these deaths are a punishment for sins committed long ago. They speak of old stories, whispered tales passed down through generations, of a dark day in Mistmoor's past when the land was said to have reclaimed its own. Others argue it's a poison or a plague, something insidious that's silently spreading through the town. Mistmoor's librarian and unofficial historian recalls reading about strange deaths in Mistmoor's archives. The records were sparse, fragmented, but she remembers one detail: an unusual mark on the bodies, similar to the smudges Miles described. Evelyn's mind races as she considers the implications, her heart pounding as she realizes she may be the only one who knows the town's dark history. But she can't bring herself to speak of it, not yet. As the day drags on, tensions reach a boiling point. Families barricade themselves indoors while others gather in the square, demanding answers. The town feels like it's on the brink of chaos, and every glance, every conversation carries a weight of accusation. People begin to turn on each other, suspecting foul play, betrayal. Mistmoor is no longer a place of peace. It's a town under siege, each resident a potential enemy. At the town hall, Owen, Miles, and Evelyn meet again, this time joined by Henry. They discuss their options, though each suggestion feels as futile as the last. Miles proposes sending blood samples to a nearby lab, but it will take days for any results to come back, and they don't have that kind of time. Evelyn suggests revisiting the town's archives, hoping to uncover more about the strange deaths in Mistmoor's history. She volunteers to search through the records, even as a chill of fear runs down her spine. Henry proposes a town-wide prayer vigil, hoping to calm people's nerves, but Owen is skeptical. People want answers, not prayers, he says, frustration evident in his voice. They want to know why their friends and family are dying, why this is happening to our town. As they argue, a frantic knock sounds at the door. It's Blair Sanchez, the town's herbalist, her face pale and terrified. "It's happening faster," she says, her voice shaking. "I just found my sister. She's gone, and she had that same mark on her hand." Her voice breaks, and she looks at Miles with pleading eyes. "Is there anything you can do?" Miles feels the weight of her gaze, the pressure of their desperation. But he's helpless. There's nothing he can do, nothing any of them can do. They're trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. As the clock nears 3 p.m., Mistmoor's death toll has climbed higher, and with each passing hour, the fear and tension grow. People gather in the town square, eyes haunted, voices hushed. They watch the town hall, waiting for someone to emerge with answers. But none come. By 3 p.m., a deathly quiet has fallen over Mistmoor, broken only by murmurs and the tolling of the church bell for each life lost. Families huddle indoors, locking windows and whispering desperate prayers. Mistmoor has always been a tight-knit town, bound by generations of shared history and neighborly trust, but today that unity feels like it's hanging by a thread. In the last hour, the number of deaths has surged again, pushing the town's losses to nearly 20%. In the square, a group of frightened residents gather. Henry Thompson, Mistmoor's priest, stands at the head of the crowd, trying to lead them in prayer. He grips a small, well-worn cross in his hand, its silver gleaming in the dimming light. He's normally a calming presence, but his voice shakes as he calls for unity and courage. Across from him, a mother, Tessa Porter, clutches her 2 young children, her gaze flickering toward the people around her. The atmosphere is thick with suspicion and fear, each face in the crowd marked by a haunting question: who's next? Dr. Miles Foster and Owen Ellis, the mayor, stand off to the side, observing the crowd. The doctor is visibly haggard, dark circles under his eyes, his jaw clenched in frustration and grief. He spent the last few hours examining bodies, but each one presents the same baffling signs. No wounds, no signs of illness, only that dark, unsettling smudge on each left palm. "They're scared," Owen mutters, his voice low. "And so am I." He watches as the crowd shifts, voices rising in anger and fear. If we don't find some answers soon, they'll tear each other apart. "Fear does strange things to people," Miles replies, rubbing his temples. "We're losing people by the hour, and I still don't know why." Owen's face hardens. "Then we need to find someone who does." Around the square, whispers circulate, each theory more alarming than the last. Phoebe Hawkins, a local shop owner, quietly talks with a few friends, her voice trembling. "My grandmother used to say the land here. It has a memory," she murmurs. "She told stories about a curse, said it was laid down long before any of us were born." One of her friends, Naomi Craig, a teacher who has already lost 2 family members today, nods. "I've heard the same. They say the forest remembers, that it comes for those who've forgotten." Theories like these spread rapidly, sowing fear and mistrust. Some suggest that someone among them has brought this curse upon the town, while others whisper that the deaths are the work of an angry spirit or even a dark spell cast by someone with a vendetta against Mistmoor. By 4 p.m., the atmosphere shifts from fearful to confrontational. Paranoia has taken root, and fingers are being pointed. One resident, Marcus Jacobs, a notoriously outspoken man, raises his voice, directing suspicion toward the town's herbalist, Blair Sanchez. Blair has always been a bit of an outsider, her knowledge of plants and herbs sometimes viewed with suspicion by the more traditional townsfolk. "It's Blair," Marcus shouts, his voice echoing through the square. "She's the one who knows about poisons and strange remedies. She's always been mixing things, selling strange herbs. She's the one who's done this. Blair stands at the edge of the crowd, her face pale, her hands shaking as she lifts them defensively. I haven't done anything. I'm as scared as you all are, she protests. But Marcus and a few others continue to hurl accusations, calling her a witch, claiming she's cursed them all. The crowd closes in around her, their anger intensifying. Just as it seems the mob will turn violent, Evelyn Kane, Mistmoor's librarian, steps forward. She's clutching a worn book, her face set with grim determination. Enough, she shouts, her voice cutting through the noise. Blair is not responsible for this. Evelyn opens the book, displaying a page covered in faded writing and old sketches. I found records, she begins, glancing at the crowd. Records of deaths in Mistmoor that happened a long, long time ago. They're sparse, barely even complete sentences, but they describe patterns. Patterns just like what we're experiencing now. People were found dead, no wounds, no signs of illness, just a mark on their hands. The crowd falls silent, eyes wide as they listen to Evelyn's words. The records say the land took them, she continues, her voice hushed. It was an evil day, a day when the land reclaimed its own. The townsfolk exchanged terrified glances, the weight of Evelyn's words sinking in. Marcus, who had led the accusations against Blair, mutters nervously, his confidence faltering. You're saying this has happened before? Yes, Evelyn says firmly, and blaming each other won't help us. We're dealing with something far older than we understand. For a moment, the crowd is subdued, their anger turning to fear and confusion. But soon, doubt creeps back in. So what then? Someone asks. Are we supposed to just sit here and wait to die? Others nod in agreement, their fear transforming back into agitation. It's clear that Evelyn's revelation has done little to reassure them. If anything, it has only deepened their fear. As dusk approaches, Henry suggests that everyone gather in the church for a night of prayer and solidarity. It's the only place we have left, he says. If this is truly an evil day, then we must face it together. Our unity may be the only thing strong enough to keep us safe. Reluctantly, the crowd agrees, and people begin shuffling toward the church, their steps heavy with uncertainty. The church becomes a sanctuary for the remaining townsfolk, each pew filling with frightened faces. Parents hold their children close, elderly residents clutch rosaries, and everyone's eyes are fixed on Henry, who stands at the front of the room, leading them in quiet prayer. Outside, the shadows deepen as night falls over Mistmoor. The town's silence feels oppressive, broken only by the occasional sound of a distant animal call or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Inside the church, the air is thick with tension, every whispered prayer laced with fear. As the final light fades from the sky, Henry lowers his head, leading the congregation in one last prayer for peace and protection. The faces around him are marked with exhaustion and despair, their eyes fixed on him as if he alone holds the key to their survival. But as midnight draws closer, each of them can't help but wonder if their prayers will be answered, or if Mistmoor will be swallowed whole by the shadow that has claimed so many already. The heavy doors of the church groan as they close, sealing Mistmoor's remaining residents inside. Shadows cling to every corner, stretching up the walls and casting an eerie gloom over the pews. It's just past 8 p.m., and nearly half of Mistmoor's population is gathered here, desperate for sanctuary. Children cling to their parents, old friends hold hands, and neighbors exchange solemn nods, trying to reassure each other, but the fear in their eyes betrays them. Outside, Mistmoor lies silent under a blanket of fog, the stillness broken only by the occasional rustle of wind and distant creaks from old buildings. Henry Thompson, Mistmoor's priest, steps to the front of the sanctuary, his face pale but resolute. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he says, his voice trembling slightly. "We will face this together, as a community. Whatever darkness we're facing, we'll stand against it." As Henry leads the congregation in prayer, whispers ripple through the crowd. People can't shake the feeling that they're being watched, though they can't see by whom. Evelyn Kane glances around nervously, clutching the worn book she brought from the library. She's seen too many connections between Mistmoor's history and today's events to dismiss this as mere coincidence. Blair Sanchez, Mistmoor's herbalist, stands at the back of the room, keeping her distance from those who had accused her earlier. She feels the weight of their suspicious glances and mutters of witch and curse as she attempts to find some measure of peace among them. But with each passing moment, the atmosphere grows thicker, as if something unseen is pressing down on everyone. "Why don't we just leave?" someone whispers loudly enough for the others to hear. Marcus Jacobs, always the one to stir trouble. Voices what many have been thinking. We're sitting ducks here. If something's coming for us, then what's the point of staying? Henry raises his hand to quiet the murmur. Leaving isn't an option, he replies. The fog is too dense, and we don't know what we'd be walking into out there. For now, we're safer together. Just as he speaks, the lights flicker and go out, plunging the church into darkness. Gasps and cries fill the sanctuary, and several people huddle closer together. The only light comes from the dim glow of Henry's candle at the front of the room, casting long flickering shadows over their faces. Outside, a heavy silence has settled, broken only by the sound of distant footsteps, barely audible, but enough to make every heart beat faster. Some people say it's just an animal or the wind. But Blair, who's lived by the edge of Mistmoor's dense woods her entire life, knows the sound is different. It's measured, purposeful, the cadence of something or someone approaching. As tension reaches a breaking point, a piercing scream shatters the quiet. The congregation turns to see Phoebe Hawkins, the shop owner, pointing out one of the stained glass windows. Her face is pale, her fingers shaking as she stammers, There was someone watching us from outside." The crowd rises, panicked whispers filling the church. Several people press against the windows, trying to catch a glimpse, but the fog outside is thick, cloaking the world in gray. "It was just the fog," Henry insists, attempting to calm them, but his voice wavers. He's not sure of anything anymore. A few minutes later, the strange phenomena begin. Soft tapping sounds echo through the sanctuary, seemingly from every direction. People twist around trying to locate the source, but it moves, shifting from one corner of the church to another, as if something unseen is circling them. The whispers grow louder, more frantic, as parents shush their children and pull them close. Evelyn stands near the back, her heart racing as she glances down at the book in her hands. She remembers a passage she'd read, an old legend about a presence in Mistmoor that could claim lives as silently as the fog itself. The townspeople had once believed that on the darkest of nights, the spirits would come to collect their due. She shudders, but says nothing, knowing that this knowledge would only deepen the fear around her. Suddenly, the temperature in the church drops. Breath becomes visible in the cold, and people wrap their coats tighter around themselves, casting wary glances around the dim space. Several people report feeling hands brush against them, though when they look, there's no one there. Others hear faint whispers, indistinguishable words, but sinister nonetheless. Blair, desperate to prove her innocence and protect the others, steps forward. "I may know of something that could help," she says, her voice barely audible over the rising panic. The crowd parts reluctantly as she makes her way to the front, feeling their judgmental eyes on her. Reaching into her satchel, Blair pulls out a bundle of dried herbs and a small vial. "This is sage," she explains, "and I have oil that's been blessed. It might help us drive away. Whatever it is that's haunting us." She looks to Henry, who hesitates, then nods reluctantly, giving her permission. Blair begins to walk down the aisles, sprinkling the oil and burning the sage, murmuring an old prayer under her breath. The air fills with the earthy scent, mingling with the fog and the fear. But as she reaches the last row, something thuds against the church door, a heavy, resounding bang that echoes through the sanctuary. The entire congregation freezes, eyes wide, breath held. Someone or something is outside. The knocking sounds again, slow and deliberate like the beat of a drum. Henry steps forward, determined to protect his flock, but his hands shake as he grasps the handle. As he pulls the door open, only fog and darkness greet him. There's no sign of anyone, yet the chill in the air feels sharper, more biting. A strange metallic smell drifts into the church, as if something ancient and powerful has just passed through the doorway. "I think we're being toyed with," Evelyn whispers to Blair. "Whatever this is, it's not just here to scare us. It's watching, waiting for something." In the back row, Tessa Porter feels a brush against her ankle. She glances down, gasping when she sees a strange mark, a dark smudge on her own hand. Panic wells up inside her, and she tries to rub it off, but it won't budge. She whispers urgently to her husband, showing him her hand, her eyes wide with terror. One by one, others begin to notice the same mark on their hands, each growing more frantic. Murmurs turn to cries as people frantically rub at the smudges, trying to erase the inexplicable stains. "It's like the others," someone whispers. "Like the ones who died." Henry tries to regain control of the situation, but his own faith is shaken. Each face in the crowd looks haunted, fearful, a stark contrast to the peaceful expressions on the victims' faces. The weight of what's happening presses down on him, and he realizes with dread that he has no more answers than they do. The church bell's 10 haunting tolls echo through Mistmoor, each strike laced with a sense of doom. In the dimly lit sanctuary, the townsfolk huddle closer, staring at the shadows stretching across the walls. The bell's final chime fades, but the oppressive silence that follows is almost worse. It's just past 10 p.m., and fear hangs thick in the air, heavier than the fog outside. The church doors creak as Henry secures them, his face pale with worry. He turns back to the congregation, but words fail him. There's nothing he can say to erase the fear in their eyes, or the mysterious smudges that have now appeared on many hands. It's as if Mistmoor itself is marked, a town waiting to be claimed. In the back row, Tessa Porter clutches her children, her eyes wide with panic. The mark on her hand refuses to fade no matter how hard she scrubs. Her husband, Logan Porter, tries to comfort her, but she can see the fear etched into his face too. "It's a curse," Tessa whispers, her voice trembling. "I know it is. We're all marked." "Don't say that," Logan mutters, though he can't hide his own horror. The smudge on his hand, faint but visible, feels like a countdown, a reminder of something dreadful lurking just out of sight. He glances toward Henry, as if the priest could somehow offer them a reprieve, but Henry's downcast eyes reveal he's just as lost. At the front, Evelyn Kane stands with her book, flipping through its brittle, yellowed pages. Her hands shake as she reads the sparse notes on the evil day, as the townsfolk once called it. A day when, according to legend, Mistmoor was haunted by a relentless shadow that claimed countless lives. She had assumed it was an old wives' tale, something exaggerated over the centuries, but the marks on the townsfolk's hands and the rising death toll echo the horror she's read about. Evelyn approaches Henry, her voice a hushed whisper. "It happened before," she says, her face ashen. "The last recorded evil day was over 100 years ago. It claimed more than half the town, Henry, and the only survivors were those who sought shelter." "Shelter?" Henry echoes, his brow furrowed. "From what?" "No one knows," Evelyn replies, her gaze distant. "But whatever it was tied to the town itself. Some said it was the land, reclaiming its own. Others thought it was a spirit, angry and ancient, but no one ever discovered the truth." The crowd around them shifts uneasily, overhearing fragments of their conversation. Whispers ripple through the sanctuary as Evelyn's words sink in, and panic bubbles to the surface. "If this happened before, why didn't anyone warn us?" Marcus Jacobs demands, his voice laced with accusation. "Why did they hide it?" Evelyn lowers her gaze, ashamed. "Some memories are too painful to pass down," she murmurs. "Perhaps they thought it would never happen again." Suddenly, a sharp knock sounds at the door, startling everyone. The crowd gasps and all eyes turn to Henry, who looks as rattled as they do. No one is expected. No one should be expected. Henry takes a deep breath, steadying himself, then steps cautiously toward the door. He hesitates, feeling the weight of every fearful eye upon him, and slowly pulls the door open. Standing in the fog-drenched night is a lone figure cloaked in shadow. It's Isaac Foster, Dr. Miles Foster's nephew who'd recently come to visit the doctor. His face is pale, his eyes wild as he stumbles inside. "Uncle Miles sent me," he says breathlessly. "He needs you to come quickly." The crowd parts as Isaac steps forward, his voice trembling. He said, he thinks he's found something. Evelyn, Henry, and a few others exchange glances, torn between relief and dread. Miles has been working relentlessly since the first death this morning, searching for any clue, any answer that might stop the horror gripping Mistmoor. Henry nods, gesturing for Evelyn and a few trusted townsfolk, including Blair and Logan, to accompany him. They move toward the door, leaving the rest of the congregation huddled in silence. The air outside is thick and cold, the fog swallowing the weak beam of their flashlights as they step into the night. The streets of Mistmoor are deserted, an eerie silence hanging over the empty homes and darkened windows. The fog coils around their feet, thickening as they move closer to the clinic. Every shadow seems to move, every sound amplified in the stillness. Blair clutches her satchel, muttering protective charms under her breath, while Logan keeps his eyes fixed forward, his grip tight on Tessa's hand. As they approach the clinic, they notice small symbols chalked onto doors and windows, a circle with a single line through it. Evelyn recognizes it as a protective mark, a sign the townsfolk have used for generations to ward off evil spirits. But tonight, the marks feel futile, like a desperate prayer that's gone unheard. They find Miles in the clinic's back room, surrounded by medical texts and samples. He looks up, his face drawn with exhaustion and grim determination. "Thank you for coming," he says quietly, gesturing for them to sit. He doesn't mince words. "I've run every test I can think of, looked through every record, every case study, and I'm beginning to think we're dealing with something beyond science." He points to a series of notes scribbled across a chalkboard. They describe symptoms: peaceful expression, lack of physical trauma, strange smudge on palm, that match every victim so far. "I don't have answers, but I've noticed one thing," Miles says. "The mark. It's not just on the left hand of each victim. It seems to grow darker on each person before they pass." He gestures to a microscope with a slide beneath it. "I took samples from the most recent victims. There's something foreign, something I can't identify. It's almost as if their cells are decaying, but not from disease. It's like the life is being drained from them." Henry, Blair, and Evelyn exchange horrified glances. "Is there anything that could explain this?" Henry asks, his voice barely a whisper. Miles shakes his head. "Not scientifically, no, but folklore. Folklore speaks of spirits that feed on life, that mark their victims in advance. It's a stretch, I know, but at this point, I'm out of rational explanations." Evelyn's face pales as she recalls more from her book. The evil day. It's said to be a day when the spirit of the land itself reclaims what it's owed. The mark could be a claim. The people marked might be taken as part of some ancient ritual. Her words hang heavy in the air. The implications are horrifying, and the others can barely process it. But the marks are real. The deaths are real, and with each hour, more lives are claimed. "Then how do we break it?" Logan asks, his voice thick with desperation. "There has to be a way to end this." "I don't know," Evelyn whispers, her voice barely audible. "The book only says that shelter may offer protection, but nothing is certain." Miles steps forward, his gaze fixed on the others. "There may be one option," he says slowly, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "If the land itself is cursed, maybe we need to appease it. Return something, an offering." The group falls silent, the weight of his words settling over them. "You mean a sacrifice?" Blair asks, horrified. Miles doesn't answer, but the look in his eyes says enough. The room is thick with dread as they each grapple with the idea, each realizing the terrible possibility that has fallen on them. As they make their way back to the church, the fog seems darker, more oppressive. Each of them is marked, each uncertain of what the night holds. Inside the sanctuary, the remaining townsfolk look up at them, their faces full of fear and expectation. The night in Mistmoor has never felt so dark. It's just past midnight, and the fog seems denser, pressing against the church windows, almost as if it were alive, trying to seep inside. The townsfolk who've sought refuge in the sanctuary huddle together, faces drawn, haunted by the sight of the smudges on their hands and the echoes of the church bell. They've barricaded themselves in, clinging to the last scraps of safety they believe the church walls offer. But even here, fear has settled deep, each passing second heavy with the unknown. Henry Thompson, the priest, stands at the front, clutching his cross with a mix of faith and desperation. He glances at Evelyn, Miles, and Blair, their expressions mirroring his own growing dread. The idea of a sacrifice has hung unspoken between them, a dark suggestion none of them want to confront. And yet, with each minute that ticks by, the unthinkable begins to feel like the only option. Dr. Miles Foster clears his throat, his voice barely a whisper as he speaks to the small group huddled in the corner. Henry, Blair, Evelyn, and a few other trusted townsfolk, including Logan Porter and Phoebe Hawkins. I know this sounds impossible, but if we're dealing with something ancient, something that's bound to the land, perhaps appeasing it could be our only option. Returning something it wants." The crowd looks at him wide-eyed. Logan's fists clench, his jaw tight. "So what? We just offer someone up? You're saying we need to sacrifice one of our own?" Miles holds his hands up, his expression conflicted. "I don't know what else to suggest. This pattern, these marks, if it's connected to some sort of ancient pact or ritual, then maybe we're dealing with a force that has its own rules. Something that requires balance." Phoebe's voice wavers as she speaks up. "This sounds like madness. How could we even think about doing that to someone? To anyone?" Blair, who's been silent, steps forward, her voice soft but firm. "We're running out of time. The deaths are increasing every hour. If we don't try something, then we may all be lost by morning." The group falls silent, the weight of Blair's words sinking in. They glance around the sanctuary, looking at the weary, frightened faces of their friends, neighbors, loved ones. The fog seems to press harder against the windows, thickening as if it senses the town's growing vulnerability. They can't escape it. There's no leaving Mistmoor tonight. The fog has sealed them in. Evelyn, who's been clutching her worn book, speaks up. In the oldest stories, the land was said to demand a life in exchange for peace. Sometimes it was an offering of grain, sometimes an animal. But in times of great need, when the land was angry, it was said a human life could be required to restore the balance. Her words are met with gasps, and Logan's eyes narrow, his tone hard. "So you're saying someone has to die so the rest of us can live?" "No one is suggesting that," Henry interjects, his voice tense but steady. "We're exploring our options, trying to understand what we're up against. But if this truly is a spirit, a force tied to this land, maybe there is another way to communicate with it." Phoebe shudders, casting a wary glance at the windows. "And if it doesn't work, what then?" As if in answer, a soft thud echoes through the sanctuary. The congregation freezes, eyes darting to the sound's source. There, near the back of the room, one of the younger townspeople, Zara Gibson, stands with a haunted look on her face. She raises her left hand, revealing the dark smudge that has spread to cover her entire palm. It's darker, almost ink black, more distinct than the other smudges they've seen. I didn't have this before," Zara stammers, her voice choked with fear. "It just appeared. I don't understand." The crowd draws back from her slightly, whispers of "marked" and "claimed" floating through the air. Evelyn's face turns ashen as she watches Zara, realizing that the smudges are not just signs of death, they are a countdown. "We're losing more people by the hour," Evelyn murmurs to Henry and Miles, her voice thick with dread. "Whatever this is, it's accelerating." The notion of sacrifice takes hold in the minds of the congregation, spreading like wildfire. Some begin to argue that perhaps the land has chosen people already, that those with the marks are the claimed. Henry tries to reason with them, insisting that they stay calm, that they wait and try to find another solution. But as more people begin to notice the darkening marks on their hands, the crowd's patience wanes, desperation taking over. A young man, Kai Mendoza, steps forward, the mark on his hand nearly black. "If we're chosen," he says in a low, fearful voice, "maybe we need to give ourselves willingly. Maybe that's the only way to end this." Blair shakes her head vehemently, tears welling in her eyes. "There has to be another way. I won't stand by and let people die like this." The clock strikes 1 a.m., and another set of tolls echoes through the town. Every face turns pale, each toll of the bell reminding them of those already lost. More people in the crowd begin to find marks on their palms, some faint, others nearly black. The death toll has risen to nearly 30% now, the toll so staggering that many townsfolk can hardly believe it. Panic grips them, and desperation leads some to advocate for a terrible course of action. Marcus, who has been among the loudest voices all night, steps forward, his gaze intense. "The land wants a sacrifice," he says, his voice shaking but determined. "Maybe we need to listen. We have no other options, not if we want to survive the night." Logan, his face etched with horror, stares at him. "You're talking about sending people to their deaths, people we know, people we care about." Marcus's gaze darkens. "And if we do nothing, we'll all die. The land is hungry, and it's coming for each of us." As the argument escalates, Henry raises his hands, calling for silence. "We won't be sending anyone to their death." he says firmly, though the tremor in his voice betrays his own fear. There's no proof that a sacrifice will stop this. We don't even know what we're dealing with. But the crowd is growing more agitated, the whispers of sacrifice and appeasement growing louder. Each person glances at the mark on their hand, wondering if they're next, and a sense of hopelessness permeates the room. Blair, sensing the danger, steps forward, her voice rising above the noise. "There are herbs, ancient rituals," she says desperately. "We could try protection spells, things that have worked for centuries to guard against curses. We don't have to resort to violence." A few people seem comforted by her words, but others remain unconvinced. The idea of appeasement has taken root too deeply, and the desperation in the room only grows. Henry and Evelyn exchange a worried glance, realizing that the town may be on the brink of tearing itself apart. Suddenly, a chilling wind sweeps through the sanctuary, rattling the windows and sending a shock through the congregation. The fog presses harder against the glass, shapes shifting within its depths. Whispers, faint, eerie, begin to echo through the church, each word indiscernible but laced with malice. The crowd falls silent, every face turning toward the windows. The shapes seem to dance in the fog, darker shadows moving with unnatural fluidity, their forms bending and twisting. The fog swirls as if alive, as if beckoning the townsfolk closer. A scream pierces the silence. Zara, who is standing near the door, collapses, her body going limp, her face frozen in a calm, unnatural smile. The black mark on her hand has spread up her arm like ink leaching into her veins. The townsfolk stare in horror, some backing away, others frozen in place. Zara's death, witnessed by all, cements the terror that has gripped Mistmoor. The night feels endless, and as they look at each other with a mix of fear and resignation, they realize that none of them may live to see the dawn. It's now 2 a.m., and Mistmoor's sanctuary feels more like a tomb. The church is steeped in an unnatural silence, thick and oppressive, only broken by the terrified whispers of those huddled together inside. The townsfolk cling to each other, too afraid to leave, yet unable to shake the feeling that remaining here may be just as deadly. The thick fog presses against the church windows, swirling with shadows that twist and writhe as if alive. The temperature has dropped, and each breath mists the air, giving their surroundings a bone-chilling quality. Henry Thompson, the priest, stands at the altar, his once steady hands now trembling. He's lost his voice of calm and strength. The mounting deaths and strange phenomena have shattered his confidence. He gazes down at the people in the pews, their faces drawn with fear, their hands marked with the ominous dark smudges. Every time his eyes linger on those marks, he feels a tightening in his chest, a gnawing certainty that these marks are a countdown, an unseen force ticking through them, waiting for its next victim. In the back, a heated argument breaks out. Marcus Jacobs, his voice rising with desperation, is pacing furiously. "This is pointless. We're sitting here like sheep, just waiting to be slaughtered. If a sacrifice is what the land wants, maybe we should consider it. It's the only thing we haven't tried." Henry steps down from the altar, attempting to maintain control. "Enough of this, Marcus," he says, his voice steadying as he faces the agitated man. "We don't know what we're dealing with. Turning on each other won't save us." But Marcus is beyond reason. He points a shaking finger toward the small group of townsfolk in the corner. Among them, Blair Sanchez and Evelyn Kane. "You're all fools. Blair's herbs and rituals have done nothing. Evelyn's stories have only scared us more. And look where it's gotten us, nowhere." Blair raises her voice, her tone resolute. "Turning on each other is exactly what this thing wants. I don't know what's behind this, but it thrives on our fear. We can't give in to it." But her words fall on deaf ears. The group is splintering, each person's desperation mounting as they eye each other with suspicion. The idea of a sacrifice has infected their minds, an insidious thought that refuses to leave. Some of the townsfolk, those whose hands have yet to darken with the smudges, are starting to distance themselves from those marked, as if proximity alone might determine who's next. Suddenly, a young woman, Tessa Porter, lets out a strangled gasp, clutching at her chest. The mark on her hand has grown darker, spreading up her arm. "No, no, please," she cries, her voice thick with terror. Logan, her husband, holds her, his face stricken. In the tension-filled silence, Marcus steps forward, his eyes fixed on her. "If she's marked, maybe she should go," he mutters, his voice cold and detached. Logan rounds on him, anger flashing in his eyes. You're suggesting we sacrifice my wife? Are you insane? His fists clench, and for a moment, it looks as though he might strike Marcus. Henry rushes between them, hands raised, his voice commanding. That's enough. We will not do this. We will not let fear make us into monsters. But the fear is too deeply rooted now. As Tessa's breathing grows ragged, the townsfolk watch her as if she's a living omen, a preview of what might come for each of them. The panic in the room rises, whispering voices discussing whether those marked are cursed, already claimed by whatever dark force is haunting Mistmoor. Blair, desperate to turn the focus away from talk of sacrifice, gathers a few people close. Evelyn, Miles, Henry, and Phoebe Hawkins, whispering frantically. There's one last thing I can try, she says, her voice shaking. In the old texts, there's mention of a ritual for protection. It's not foolproof, but it might shield us from the force taking these lives. Evelyn nods, her expression grim but hopeful. We have to try. If it doesn't work, then maybe we consider Marcus's idea, but only if we're truly out of options. Blair begins to set up the ritual, placing bundles of herbs and stones in a protective circle. She murmurs ancient words, her voice carrying through the sanctuary as she casts the ritual around those marked with the smudges. A hush falls over the group as they watch, clinging to the hope that maybe this, finally, will be enough to save them. Just as Blair completes the ritual, a strange light flickers through the church windows, a soft glow coming from the fog outside, illuminating the twisted shapes within. At first, people believe it to be the light of lanterns or flashlights, but the shapes continue to twist, seemingly alive within the fog. Suddenly, the figures materialize more clearly, pressing against the windows. Dozens of faces, spectral and haunting, stare into the church. Their expressions are blank, but their eyes burn with a cold intensity. The fog churns around them, thickening as the spectral figures grow in number, surrounding the church on all sides. Henry gasps, his hand flying to his mouth. Those are the faces of the dead, he whispers. The congregation watches in horror as the apparitions of their lost loved ones press against the windows, their hands reaching out as though beckoning them to come outside. Logan holds his children tightly, his face pale. This can't be happening, he mutters. They're supposed to be at peace. One of the townsfolk lets out a scream and bolts for the door, only to be restrained by Marcus and Henry. Stay inside, Henry shouts, his voice laced with desperation. They're not real. They're shadows. But the townsfolk are now too terrified to listen. The figures outside pound on the windows, the fog swirling as if alive. The sanctuary that once felt safe now feels like a trap, the dead haunting them from every direction, urging them out. Marcus, frantic and consumed by fear, shouts, "We have to appease them. We have to give them what they want." He turns to Tessa, his eyes wild. "They're here for the marked. Maybe if we let her go." Logan blocks him, fury in his eyes. "Touch her, and I swear." "I'll?" But before he can finish, Tessa lets out a choked sob. "No, if it will save everyone, maybe he's right. Maybe we have to make a sacrifice." Henry, Evelyn, and Blair try to stop her, to reassure her that they don't need to do this. But the crowd is reaching a fever pitch, their fear mutating into a dangerous frenzy. In the chaos, the line between reason and madness blurs, and some begin to argue that Tessa, with her darkened mark, is already beyond saving. Phoebe Hawkins raises her voice, pleading with them to calm down. "This is exactly what it wants," she cries, her voice cracking. "It's feeding on our fear. If we turn on each other, we're lost." But her voice is drowned out by the commotion. The crowd begins to turn on Tessa, their voices frenzied, their faces wild with fear. They close in around her, each person driven by the terror of the unknown, the desperation to survive. Henry raises his voice, desperate to break through the madness. "Listen to me. This is not the answer. We can't give in to fear. If we start sacrificing our own, we become the monsters we're so afraid of." His words seem to reach some of them, and a few people back away, shame flickering across their faces. But others remain resolute, their fear too deeply rooted, too consuming. Suddenly, as if summoned by their frenzied desperation, the heavy church doors creak open. The fog rolls in, thick and alive, spilling into the sanctuary. The spectral figures press closer, their eyes cold and unfeeling as they stare at the crowd within. The townsfolk scream, backing away, but the fog moves with purpose, swirling toward those who bear the darkest marks. One by one, those marked with the deepest stains collapse to the ground, their expressions calm, peaceful, as if they've simply fallen asleep. The townsfolk stare, horrified, as Tessa and others pass from this world in utter silence, claimed by whatever force haunts Mistmoor. The fog recedes, slipping back through the open doors as the spectral figures vanish into the night. The remaining townsfolk watch in stunned silence, their hearts pounding. Henry falls to his knees, a mix of grief and relief overwhelming him as he realizes that, somehow, they may have survived the worst of it, but that the horror of what they've witnessed lingers, an indelible mark left on their souls. Mistmoor has claimed its due, and as the first light of dawn pierces the fog, they know that they will never look at their town the same way again.